friends. Welcome to Nerdy Bitz, TLDL, Too Long Didn't Listen. I'm your host, the Reverend Tracy, and this is where we take one study, one concept, or one piece of psychology and break it down so you get all the nerdy good stuff without the textbook hangover. So this episode is a companion to our main episode on the psychology of mom. And specifically, I wanted to zoom in on one study that ended up resonating with a lot of people because it tried to put numbers to something many caregivers already intuitively understood. The idea that being a stay-at-home mother is not really one job. It's multiple jobs layered on top of each other at the same time. And once you connect that idea to what psychology tells us about cognitive load and working memory, the mental exhaustion side of modern parenting starts to make a lot more sense. Like we talked about in the main episode, when people talk about parenting stress, they often focus on the visible work, the diapers, the meals, the school pickups, the bedtime routines. But one of the things psychology researchers have increasingly focused on is the invisible layer underneath all of that. The planning, the remembering, the monitoring, the constant mental tracking of needs, schedules, emotions, supplies, appointments, and contingency plans. But don't get too attached to all those because the next developmental milestone is going to shuffle and redeal the entire parenting deck on you, and usually with very little warning. And this is where the psychology side becomes really important because one of the researchers most associated with cognitive load theory is psychologist John Sweller. We did talk about him as well. And his work focuses on the limits of working memory and how sustained mental demand affect performance, stress, and mental fatigue. Sweller's research was originally focused more on learning and information processing, not really specific to parenting. But the concept translates incredibly well into caregiving because parenting constantly requires the brain to juggle competing demands, priorities, and streams of information simultaneously. Cognitive load theory basically starts from a simple reality. Your working memory has limits. The brain can only actively manage so many pieces of information, planning tasks, emotional calculations, and ongoing responsibilities before the strain starts to build. Now, cognitive load in psychology originally referred to the amount of mental effort being used by working memory. In simple terms, your brain can only actively juggle so many things at once before performance, focus, and emotional regulation start to suffer. And parenting, especially modern parenting, creates an enormous amount of ongoing cognitive demand. One study that got a lot of media attention came from Salary.com, and it attempted to quantify the number of roles many stay-at-home mothers regularly perform within a household. Again, this wasn't a clinical neuroscience study. It was more of an occupational and labor analysis. But the reason it connected with so many people is because it tried to quantify something caregivers had been describing for years. That the role itself is fragmented across multiple simultaneous responsibilities. The study compared the work of stay-at-home mothers to multiple overlapping but traditionally salaried roles: child care provider, household manager, scheduler, transportation coordinator, cook, administrative assistant, event planner, and emotional support system. And whether or not the exact salary estimates were perfect honestly mattered less than the broader point the study was trying to illustrate. It's not just one job. It's multiple ongoing responsibilities being managed simultaneously. Not one task after another, but constant mental switching between caregiving, planning, emotional regulation, logistics, problem solving, and anticipating needs before they become problems. And unlike most jobs, many of those demands are happening simultaneously, not sequentially. You know, like in those karate movies where all the bad guys politely attack one at a time. No, at the same time. Like a real group fight where everybody jumps in at once and your brain is trying to manage all of it simultaneously while also trying to remember what you were going to cook for dinner tonight. So you're helping one child regulate emotions while mentally tracking whether there's enough milk in the fridge for the week, remembering that somebody has a dentist appointment on Thursday, trying not to forget the permission slip on the counter, and monitoring whether dinner is burning. It's not just being busy. It's sustained cognitive multitasking, and the brain pays for that in the long term as well. One of the most important things to understand about cognitive load is that the brain doesn't really distinguish very well between physical attacks and mental management. People tend to validate exhaustion when they can visibly see labor happening, but a huge amount of parenting fatigue comes from ongoing mental processing, the constant need to anticipate problems before they happen, the constant need to keep track of everybody else's needs, the constant low-level monitoring that never fully immediately powers down because, like we talked about in the main episode, the maternal brain is literally wired to stay more alert to caregiving-related needs and changes, not less. Researchers studying pregnancy and postpartum adaptation have already found that the maternal brain goes through measurable shifts associated with attention, emotional sensitivity, threat detection, and social bonding. Some of the most widely discussed work in this area comes from researchers like Elsaline Hoeksema, whose neuroimaging studies found measurable brain changes associated with pregnancy and early motherhood. And importantly, these findings are generally interpreted as adaptive changes, not damage. The maternal brain appears to become more specialized around caregiving, emotional attunement, and responsiveness to infant needs. In other words, the brain is already operating in a heightened state of awareness around caregiving and responsiveness, which makes sense from a survival perspective. A parent who notices subtle changes quickly is more capable of responding to a child's needs. But when that heightened awareness gets paired with modern expectations, endless information streams, social pressure through our social media scrolls, financial stress, and constant accessibility, it can become overwhelming. And this is one of the reasons moms will often describe feeling mentally exhausted, even when they technically, quote, didn't get much done that day. Because the exhaustion isn't only coming from visible output, it's coming from sustained cognitive demand, from running dozens of mental tabs all at once. And one of the frustrating things about invisible cognitive labor is that other people often only see the moments where something becomes visible. They see the completed grocery trip, not the mental inventory system that had been running it for 3 days beforehand. They see the birthday party happen, not the constant planning, scheduling, emotional management, shopping, and coordination that made it possible. They see lunches packed, not the daily mental tracking required to make sure food exists, gets replaced, stays varied enough, and fits everybody's needs. A lot of caregiving work is invisible precisely because it happens before the problems appear. And when invisible work is done well, often people assume it required no effort at all, which creates another layer of strain. Because now the person carrying the load is also carrying the emotional experience of feeling unseen. And there's another important layer here. Cognitive load doesn't just affect productivity. It affects emotional regulation, the very thing you need in these early parenting years so that you can teach your child emotional regulation. And the more overloaded your working memory becomes, the harder it is to stay patient, focused, emotionally flexible, and resilient. Which means sometimes what looks like irritability, forgetfulness, emotional overwhelm, or shutdown is not a character flaw. It's overload. That doesn't mean every reaction is healthy or justified, but it does mean the brain has limits. And these are simply symptoms of hitting that limit. Modern parenting culture often acts like those limits shouldn't exist, especially for moms. There's this strange expectation that mothers should function as endlessly available emotional infrastructure while also remaining organized, emotionally regulated, productive, socially aware, physically present, financially conscious, and somehow personally fulfilled all at the same time. And for a lot of people, that combination creates chronic stress. Not because they're failing, but because the demand itself is enormous. And this is why conversations around support matter so much. Not just helping out occasionally, actually sharing cognitive responsibility. Because there's a difference between completing a task after being asked and carrying part of the mental load itself. Remembering without reminders, planning without delegation, anticipating needs before somebody else has to carry the burden of tracking them. And that's the part people are often talking about when they say they need partnership, not just assistance. And honestly, I think this matters beyond parenting too, because a lot of people are quietly carrying invisible cognitive loads in different areas of life. Caregiving, relationships, work, emotional labor, the ongoing mental management of keeping systems functioning. And one of the easiest ways to underestimate someone's exhaustion is to only count the labor you can physically see. So maybe the takeaway here is simple. If someone seems mentally exhausted, don't only ask what they did today. Ask what they were responsible for holding together, because the brain gets tired from carrying weight that never becomes visible as well. And that's your Nerdy Bitz. Sometimes the heaviest work happening in a family is the work nobody can actually see.
Subscribe to Friends Talking Nerdy on YouTube Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify,
or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Bye-bye, friends.